Advanced Psychoproctology for Beginners. Aholes Diagnosis, Treatment, and Prevention with Dr. Jeremy Sherman. Welcome to Class 12, in which we arrive at last at practical techniques for humbly humbling Trump bots, demoting God-playing fake infallibilists down to the elevated status of human fallibilists, where we all really live. As I'll try to show here, it's a challenge made easier, not harder, by the fallibilism we've been exploring, especially in the last session. We'll start here with a fallibilist stance with which you enter confrontations with the Trump bot, and we'll finish with a core technique I'll call Obverse psychology. In confronting a Trump bot, you'll need to stay relaxed and fluid, which isn't just a matter of deciding to be. We're not robots. We can't just set some feeling dial inside ourselves to mellow mode. When dealing with Trump bots, we'll tend to get edgy. Grounding ourselves in the courage of our own fallibility can help us sustain what I'll call confidence, calm confidence. First, try this. Imagine your worst-case scenario. Ask yourself a non-rhetorical what's the worst that could happen in this encounter. Answer with a specific scenario or two. Next, imagine that despite your best efforts, it has gone wrong. You've landed in one of those worst-case scenarios. Now, how could you comfort yourself in response? What could you say to yourself and perhaps to others so that you could forgive yourself for landing in your worst-case scenario? How could you finesse the failure realistically, not like Trump bots who always absolve themselves? Your answer could be as simple as, live and learn. I tried something, it didn't work, so I'll try something else next time. Or even, I'll keep trying, but maybe I'm better at other things. You're a fallibilist. You get to say things like that. Trump bots can't, won't, or think they shouldn't. Knowing that your dignity can survive your worst outcomes will put you more at ease in tense situations, less uptight and wary about worst-case landmine. If instead you don't dare imagine the worst cases, and therefore have to wing it should the worst come to pass, you'll tend to lose your confidence. I'll call this worst-case exercise pre-grieving. Fallibilists pre-grieve the possibility that they're wrong. You know you're not some infallible exception to humankind. You wouldn't put anything past you. You're human. Nothing human is foreign to you. Though you try to avoid judgment errors, you're not shocked, flummoxed, or devastated by news that you might have made one. If you fail or someone tells you off for having some human failing, it's not the first time you've considered that possibility. With pre-grieving, you're not thrown as readily into involuntary paroxysms of self-doubt and self-defense. Anticipating how you could finesse bad outcomes orients you to the serious play of harassing a Trump bot. It is serious. You're fierce. Thwarting them matters. And you're far from fatalistic about those worst-case scenarios. You're trying to avoid them. But it's play too. If they weren't a threat to you, Trump bots would be laughingstocks. You want to take them both seriously and lightly. You want to be nimble, agile, floating like a butterfly, stinging like a bee. In confronting Trump bots, minimize your need to persuade them of anything. Sometimes you need to convince someone, for example, anyone whose decision directly affects your life and livelihood, but needing to persuade can often become a counterproductive compulsion. With Trump bots, it's counterproductive because it gives them the impression that their opinions matter a lot. Don't give them that satisfaction. Remember that if they didn't have any power over you, you wouldn't give them any attention. Trump bots are boring fools. When they're not terrifying us, they're at most amusing, pitiful ninnies. Still, hassling Trump bots is pretty hopeless if you're not prepared, hoping to just wing it. Winging it rarely works. Winging it, you'll feel a need to convince yourself that you're able to stand your ground with them. You'll say what you need to hear, mouthing off half-cocked just to prove to yourself that your mouth works. If you've got something to prove to yourself, you'll enter the ring with the Trump bot too eager, and you'll come across as ungrounded. Try to enter well-prepared, nothing to prove to yourself, and with as little to lose as possible, which again is a benefit of pre-grieving. Often we stand our ground most convincingly and effectively when we can be silent or take our time responding. Fierceness often smolders. Effective and charismatic people are often soft-spoken and taciturn. It compels others to lean in, losing their center. You'll appear far stronger if you're indifferent to changing a Trump bot's mind than you will if you're dependent on them changing. You may be working to change minds. Like Jesus, you could be a fisher of men, but try to be catch and release about it. You may be out to reel cultists back into reality, but that doesn't mean you have to persuade any particular cultists. Try thanking them for their opinion. That's gratitude, but it also demotes their authoritative proclamations to what they are, one person's opinion. If instead you treat their opinion as something imperative to change, you grant them undue power. They'll decide whether you're worthy of their precious supreme consent, and the answer, of course, is that you're not. Before confronting a Trump bot, be realistic about the range of possible outcomes, neither exaggerating nor downplaying how badly things could end. Things could end very badly for you if you're confronting a Trump bot boss, trigger-happy next-door neighbor, or abusive spouse who holds your purse strings. Even if they deserve humiliation and you can no longer stand their sadomasochistic, bullshit-dozing guts, none of that should motivate you to overlook personal risks. Stay sober about the traps Trump bots set. They can be formidable. Remember, some people neither escape nor survive Trump bots. For example, anyone oppressed or enslaved, suffering under a despot's tyranny, hoping to survive until emancipation, which never arrives in their lifetimes. Slavery in the U.S. lasted for 12 generations. Happy endings are only inevitable in popular fiction. There's no guarantee that one can survive, let alone humble a Trump bot. If God is on the side of the humble, he sure has a roundabout way of showing it. Take this job and shove it is a fine thing to say when you can. If you can't without making too big a personal sacrifice, you'll want to wait and plan for an opening and try more devious ways of hassling Trump bots. Be appropriately wary, devious, and cunning, but not foolhardy. On a cheerier note, there are plenty of missed opportunities to humble Trump bots. The techniques proposed here were barely tried with the Trump cult, despite plenty of opportunities. Maybe that's because they wouldn't have worked, but I doubt it. I think they would have worked far better than what was tried. We can overestimate our prospects for success in hassling Trump bots, but we can underestimate them too, thinking it's hopeless when it isn't. One of the worst cases you're trying to avoid is you failing to get through to the Trump bot that you're hassling, you having to walk away with the Trump bot claiming victory since you're a quitter. But that's what to expect with Trump bots. About the most you can hope for is that they'll sulk off to pick a fight with someone easier since you turned out to be a hassle. They'll still call you a quitter or whatever else, but you're a fallibilist. You know better than to take their last word condemnations as anything more than Trumpiring or frame dominance. When plotting to humble a Trump bot, you also have to factor in how much interaction you can expect with them. Like exhibitionists, Trump bots like to have an exit strategy and escape route. Their first line of defense is frame dominance, dismissing, discounting, or sneering at any challenge. But if that doesn't work, they'll tend to duck out. If you're living or working with them, you'll have lots of interaction with them, trapped in their company. If you are, then you have to attend to your own exit strategies. It's important to keep in mind that you aren't likely to make much progress in any particular interaction before the Trump bot succeeds at frame dominating the conversation to their advantage. If you do decide to duck out, remember that you too can vote with your feet, and that quitting is not a failure to a fallibilist. In the last session, I argued that when dealing with a Trump bot, any manipulative move they weaponize, you should feel free to use also, but with a difference. You know it's a trick and would happily admit to it. You're using the move ironically, they're using the move hypocritically. They'll gloat when they call you a quitter, not that they believe that quitting is always bad. They don't care whether quitting is bad. They just want to score points with you. So if you leave, they'll likely pretend it's evidence that they were just too smart, virtuous, and powerful for you. You were overwhelmed by their greatness and surrendered. A Trump bot's interpretations are always designed to make them feel heroic. You leaving proves they won yet another heroic victory. You probably know this feeling. You gave up on an exchange with a Trump bot and feel a little like you should say one last thing to make clear to them that you're not leaving because they overpowered you, but because they were a waste of time. Don't waste your breath, and don't enable them by taking their insults seriously. They're only pretending to believe that quitting proves you're a loser. Just notice this difference between a Trump bot's and your use of the word quitter. It will be important to Obverse psychology, the move I'll be introducing in this session. A Trump bot weaponizes the word quitter, ignoring its denotations, relying on its connotations as one of many ways to Trumpire, crying foul on their opponents, declaring their rivals the immoral losers. A fallibilist sees through the weaponizing and is unimpressed by such shaming. Like all moves, quitting is good in some situations and bad in others. The notion that one should never leave anything is absurd. So absurd that Trump bot doesn't even believe it. They just hope you'll believe it so they can score off you by calling you a quitter, shaming you for your failure. If you stick to your fallibilist guns, quitting is not a worst-case scenario, nor is being called one by a Trump bot, since they'll just bray whatever to get their way. So feel free to vote with your feet anytime. You're not trapped in there with them. And if they leave, give them a taste of their own BS medicine. Laugh at them for being a quitter. Not that you mean it. Again, any move they use hypocritically, feel free to use ironically. More generally, is such deviousness okay? It has its place. If someone makes you pay for sharing your honest feedback, they're unwittingly inviting you to be devious, to keep them in the dark. If someone makes you automatically wrong for disagreeing with them, you needn't change your mind and probably won't. You'll just express your opinion by other, more devious means. I've mentioned a few times that the virtue called passive resistance is spun negatively as passive aggressiveness. Though we admire passive resistance, we often mistake passive aggressiveness as a universal no-no, without noticing that it's the only recourse open to slaves and other oppressed people. Passive aggressiveness is only a vice when we have other recourse but opt to play the victim. For example, when we could afford to be direct but prefer to pout, snark, or sabotage for effect. That's misplaced deviousness. But when you have no other recourse with someone playing God to your mere mortaldom, I'll argue deviousness is warranted. But doesn't your deviousness set a bad example? Doesn't it make the Trump bot feel free to use deviousness on you? A Trump bot will act like you've just given them license to be devious, but no, they had granted it to themselves already. Remember that exchange from a few classes back, a Trump bot saying in effect, if you pick up a knife because I won't drop mine, you're just a hypocrite. 1 minute you're telling me to drop my knife, the next minute you're picking one up. That entitles me to get a machine gun. That's typical Trump bot self-rationalization. I don't bet you can thwart a true Trump bot by being honorable, never escalating into deviousness so they'll feel ashamed and de-escalate. Remember, Trump bots are shameless about their shamelessness. They'll latch on to any excuse for dominating. I think deviousness is fair game, so long as you use it fallibilistically or ironically, fooling the Trump bot but not yourself, beating them at their own game, Trump-iring the Trump-ire, frame dominating the frame dominator. Now, if you don't want to be a Trump bot yourself, you do have to expect some anxiety and criticism. You can't just write off everyone's criticism as nonsense. We do hear advice to do just that. Never care what other people think. Criticism says more about the critic than about you. All criticism is projection. A fallibilist knows any such advice is a half-truth posing as a whole truth, the kind of half-witted nonsense that Trump bots will braid to keep from ever having to consider anyone's criticism. So never listen to attacks from people you've decided are Trump bots? Never heed criticism from people who don't heed criticism? That's another one of those paradoxes that fallibilists live with and by. As such, it points to one of those life-size dilemmas, to heed or not to heed criticism. If there's anyone not to heed, it's Trump bots who never heed criticism. Feel free to ignore whatever critique you get from people you bet carefully are Trump bots. So long as you're open to criticism from non-Trump bots, you're probably receptive enough. Indeed, if you worry that you may be a Trump bot too, you're probably not one. Trump bots rarely, if ever, worry that they're Trump bots. In dealing with Trump bots, it's to your benefit to be as non-reactive as possible. Have you ever completely ignored someone who viciously flames you over and over? If you have, congratulations, you have defficacy. Self-efficacy is confidence that you can do something, born of having done something like it before. Defficacy is therefore confidence that you can turn a prolonged deaf ear to someone. If you have defficacy, that's an advantage in dealing with a live-in Trump bot. It will give you the power to duck in with the occasional devious quip and ignore what the Trump bot does in retaliation. Of course, that no-tag back ducking in and out is also an exhibitionist or Trump bot trait. How then is such deviousness justified? Again, a Trump bot does that with anyone that challenges them. You do it with someone you have carefully bet is a Trump bot, not with just anyone who challenges you. To a Trump bot, any news that challenges them is fake, and any news that flatters them is real. So long as you're not Trump-iring that way, you're probably not a Trump bot. We often overestimate what a confrontation will cost us. What does it cost you to hassle some mouthy Trump bot troll online? Probably not that much, and you'll gain some much-needed practice. And what if you lose? Well, what do you lose? Often a little status with onlookers. Most of us spend our lives trying to maintain and elevate our status for practical reasons. We need work status so we can pay our bills. We need social status so we're not alone. Still, not all status maintenance is tied to some practical imperative. It's easy to get into a compulsive habit of maintaining and elevating our status even when it's not exchangeable for practical survival prizes like keeping food on the table. If you can minimize your dependency on status, you'll find that you can often trade a loss of it for the valuable prize of speaking your mind. You might also gain some status for doing so, saying what others think but dare not say. I've won many friends by confronting Trump bots. I've lost plenty too, folks who decide I'm inappropriate or uncivil. Bless the folk who come and go. Status often matters less as we age. If you're getting on, consider yourself a frontline fallibilist ready to hassle Trump bots. You can afford the loss of status. Indeed, if we're going to age gracefully, we have to let go of status with time. It's pitiful to watch old folks still striving desperately for status long past their prime, rather than ceding ground to the young. Between about 60 and 100 years old, you have to get to where a productive day is when you had a good poop. An aging fallibilist is grateful for having had their day in the sun. They tend to age more gracefully than Trump bots, who get bitter as their bodies fail their pretense of infallibility and the world loses interest in them. Old or young, a fallibilist needs practice hassling Trump bots. Throughout this course, I've argued that the most critical takeaway should be Psychoproctology's two big questions. How do you distinguish and stop Trump bots? For that, I hope you'll study masters, for example, society's court jesters, the late-night TV comedians, or the rare, cunning politician of whatever party who flaunts their fallibilism admirably. Study how they practice their self-effacing, irreverent art. There are plenty of master fallibilists, equal opportunity deflators who invite you to laugh at them, with them, and to laugh at yourself too. I consider stand-up comedy the richest fallibilist church services available these days. Whole audiences laughing at and with each other and the comedian. The opposite of an infallibilist church service's humorless self-righteousness. Humanity is a hoot. We need to laugh more at ourselves and our human predicaments, and in the process to laugh especially hard at the pompous Trump bot asses who can't laugh at themselves. Trump bots tend to get very compulsive about changing your mind. They don't encourage you to consider possibilities. They need you to see the light, and if you don't, they take vengeance. As a fallibilist, you can tease them about that. Look, I'd be flattered that you care so much about my opinions. If it weren't obvious, you'd just need any warm body on which to play out your know-it-all fantasy. Teasing a male Trump bot's masculinity can be a useful kind of deviousness too. Play the coy but resistant ingenue, flattered by the attention. When they Trump buyer dismissing you for challenging them, you can say, "Oh, darling, I bet you say that to all your challengers." Trump bots identify with their ideas and values, not that they care about them as anything more than the empty suits of armor that they can mindlessly and heartlessly occupy. Again, it's not that these would-be emperors have no clothes, but that they're nothing but clothes. Still, they will cling, attack their notions, and they treat it as a direct assault on them. But you're a fallibilist, which means you're perfectly fine changing outfits when the old ones get stinky. When you confront a Trump bot, put some distance between yourself and your ideas, and between them and theirs too. Acknowledge the changeable opinions you both hold in the current context. Call their opinion an opinion or an interpretation. Don't assert that it's an opinion as though you have to make a case that it is. In general, avoid all attempts to get Trump bots to change their mind. It makes them the buyer and you the seller, and they'll just say an automatic "I don't buy it," as though your supply is inadequate. Assume things about them. If they want to dispute it, they'll have to go out on a limb to challenge your assumptions. Don't go out on a limb to win them over. If you're trying to win their agreement, they'll make sure you fail. Don't say, "That's just your opinion and it could change." Say, "I get it. I hear how you imagine things these days." Imagine is a cunningly ambiguous term. It can mean how someone thinks about things, as in "I imagine," but it can also imply delusion or fantasy. A Trump bot wants to convey that their mind is made up. To talk about how they imagine things suggests, yeah, and your ideas are made up too. If they take offense, you can pull right back with plausible denial. "I didn't know that would be touchy for you. I merely meant how you think about things." Poke them with ambiguous terms like that. Respond to a male Trump bot's melodramatics with the word hysterical. If they double down on their seriousness, clarify, "Oh, I might have confused you. I didn't mean it was funny. I meant hysterical like uterus, like hysterectomy. You acting like you're premenstrual." Nothing throws a Trump bot off like you tricking them. They're after frame dominance. They get to trick you. You don't get to trick them. Even if you're as committed to gender equality as I am, it's useful to try to shame macho Trump bots where they're most sensitive. I'm a fan of masturbation, but I don't mind teasing Trump bots who are ashamed of it. I often call them on jerking off in public and cults on circle jerking in public. Again, be perfectly contented to make a moving case on behalf of a Trump bot. That will confuse their assumption that their ideas are their identity. What are you doing donning my armor? It also deflates their belief that anyone who disagrees with them can't possibly understand them. By making a moving case on their behalf, you demonstrate that you understand them perfectly well and still don't agree with them. It also shows up their blind spot. Trump bots pride themselves on a weakness. They're impotent to make anyone's case but their own. Even if they tried to make your case for you, they'd end up snarky and sarcastic, parodying all counter-arguments to theirs. Trump bots think they're strong because they are bravely armored and weaponized by some idea. They're actually meekly caged by it, afraid to step out and imagine, let alone voice another perspective. As a fallibilist, you have a fallback position not afforded to Trump bots. You can apologize, take back what you said, and make amends if you misread someone to be a Trump bot who isn't. Indeed, there's a play you can make with apologies. Subtly poke a potential Trump bot. If they lash out in response, apologize for offending them. Make it heartfelt. Stand corrected with your dignity intact. If they're not a Trump bot, they'll feel a little sheepish for having lashed out. If they are a Trump bot, they won't accept your apology and will treat it as proof that you're a failure and as evidence that they're infallible. Poking and then apologizing, if necessary, is a way to stress test a possible Trump bot. A fallibilist's ability to stand corrected, their dignity intact, is an extraordinary advantage over Trump bots. You should pat yourself on the back every time you apologize cleanly. Of course, there are plenty of slippery ways to apologize. Sorry if I offended you. Sorry if you're too sensitive. Sorry for whatever. Or just a snarky, annoyed sorry as a substitute for regretting something you've done. Pat yourself on the back for real apologies, dignified, yet clear on the mistake you think you've made, and don't leave it at words. If you mean your apology, remember it, even reminding the person you've apologized to a few months later so they know you meant it. Talk is so very cheap. Saying sorry can be a substitute for reflecting and correcting. It can feel compromising to apologize to Trump bots because they'll pounce on it as evidence that because you made a mistake, you're a complete idiot. You might have experienced this challenge, for example, in a partnership. If you're with someone who can't, won't, or thinks they should never apologize, they'll pounce on your every error as proof that you're wrong and they're right about everything. The cost of being with such a partner isn't just the humiliation. It's also the disincentive to be the fallibilist you aim to be. Such people will stunt your fallibilist growth. The U.S. has been dealing with that problem at a national level. The Trump cult pounces on every error their opposition makes. I look forward to the day where we can get back to admitting to our mistakes with a formidable opposition that can admit to theirs. The nation has been dumbed down by collective Trump bot fake infallibility. The fake infallibility of any Trump bot cult is infectious. Under Trump, no one could afford to admit to mistakes. That's a recipe for stunted growth all round. That stunted growth manifests as what in Chapter 7 I described as an infallibility deathmatch. A winner takes all, loser pays all struggle over who is right about everything and who is wrong about everything. That's the kind of folly a debate can degenerate into when people start saying things like, "You think X? Wow, you don't know anything, do you?" Whether out of fear or bravado, Trump bots treat all exchanges as infallibility death matches that they must win. That feeling can be contagious. Resist it. You're a fallibilist. Don't let anyone convince you that your entire credibility is on the line or that you're right about everything. You can even tease about it in a confrontation, saying something like, "If there's one thing I won't tolerate, it's me not being able to apologize for my mistakes. I'll defend my fallibility to the bitter end." That's fallibilist bravery. It makes Trump bot know-it-all bravado look cheap and wimpy. As for the Trump bot lifestyle, be ruthless, mercilessly deflating, degrading, and again, why? Not because you disagree with their interpretation of reality, but because, as best as you can tell, they are reality deniers. They don't concede that reality matters. That is the one moral violation that counts here. Sure, you might disagree with their opinions, but going head-to-head with Trump bot on that is futile, just taking their BS bait. Focus on their BS attempts to overpower reality. We can agree to disagree about reality, but no one should get away with ignoring reality entirely, as Trump bots try to do. All living beings have to adapt to reality. With language, we can pretend we don't. And when people pretend like that, you have to kick them. Not around to your perspective on reality, but around to attending to reality at all. It's like throwing cold water in a drunkard's face. Not because you represent reality, but because we are all at reality's mercy and can't afford to have drunkards driving around and oblivious to it. When Trump bots ignore reality, people get hurt. Again, in confronting a Trump bot, you're dealing with three factors: the person, their Trump bot lifestyle, and their declared ideas and values. Try to keep these three distinct. Give the least attention to their ideas and values. For the Trump bot, their subterfuge. Try to see past their ideas or trivialize them by showing that you can don their armor to voice their opinions without being swayed by them. Focus on the Trump botting. Make them pay a price for it, but not for being a fellow human. Love the person, scorn the lifestyle. Confuse them by demonstrating a generous spirit to their person. If you know their talents and skills, then compliment, admire, flatter, and praise them. Even humble yourself before their real skills. I'll often tell them how impressed I am by some practical skill they have that I lack. If you don't know much about them, just be kind and generous to the person. You're not trying to kill them with kindness, you're trying to kill their Trump botting. Trying to make the Trump botting lifestyle feel to them like a cheesy choice for an otherwise decent person. Now we'll turn to one of two fundamental, undertried but truer ways to hassle Trump bots. And by truer, I mean more honest and realistic, which is a real advantage in doing battle with a Trump bot. You don't have to keep up appearances, you get to be yourself. These two techniques are not about maintaining some artificial pose for battle. They're how to be yourself, a grounded fallibilist. In this session, I'll present one that I call Obverse psychology, with a few related strategies for asserting your fallibilism. In our next session, I'll present the other, which I call gum babying. It's how to grab and rattle their sword hilt, not the person or the professed beliefs, but their Trump botting, their robotic use of the wild card trump card formula. Obverse psychology is how to flaunt your fallibilism at a Trump bot. It's both shield and weapon, but it's mostly shield, keeping you feeling safe and grounded in your fallibilism when a Trump bot attacks you. Trump bots pursue frame dominance, playing umpire, or as I've called it, Trumpiring, vying for the last word on who gets the last word. To Trumpire, they play moral police, citing any ethical violation they can hope to pin on you, blaring their moralizing police sirens so loud they drown out all challenges to their right mighty authority. Not that they care about their moral standards as anything other than armaments in their bullshit-dozing holy war. They just pretend to be outraged by your ethical violations, engaging in what I've called exempt by contempt, treating their theatrical outrage at your violations as evidence they couldn't ever make such violations. For example, if you ever call them a name, you're disqualified as a name caller. They hate name callers so much that it proves to them that they couldn't possibly be one, even though they just called you a name caller, which is a name. Trump bots have their wildcard trump card collection of moral absolutes to flame at you. Their behavior shows that they don't care about moral principles as anything more than a way to demote you and elevate themselves. That's the hypocrisy we find so maddening and that they find so satisfying, since to them hypocrisy is bling, a status symbol, evidence of their indomitable power. In contrast, fallibilists don't pretend to live by moral absolutes. They embrace life's tough judgment calls, for example, when to be or not to be a name caller. In contrast, fallibilists have the wisdom to keep noticing the differences, applying opposite or obverse strategies depending on the situation. You're aware that there are positives and negatives to both sides of any coin, heads, or its obverse, tails. Sometimes name-calling helps, sometimes it hinders. Sometimes not name-calling helps, sometimes it hinders. Again, Trump bots just try to make it so it's heads they win, tails you lose, and if you push back, it's tails they win and heads you lose. Whatever wins them continued freedom to bullshit doze their way mindlessly and heartlessly through life. A sucker will keep trying to guess which is the winning side of the Trump bot's coin. But you can't be on the winning side of a Trump bot's coin flips. For example, if you assert yourself, they'll say you lose for being unkind. And if you don't assert yourself, they'll say you lose for being a wimp. That's how they can use spin dominance to fuel their frame dominance. Remember the douchebot from Class 6, a robot that looks up positive words to describe its behavior and negative words to describe yours. Well, there's a way to describe any behavior positively or negatively. They're steadfast, you're pig-headed. They're assertive, you're aggressive. Or the opposite. They're receptive, you're gullible. They're open-minded, you're a sheeple. That's how they get to keep flipping the coin in their favor. In dealing with Trump bots, fallibilists often get flummoxed and defensive, as if we owe them an explanation or must defend our choices. We can forget that we're fallibilists and fall into defending ourselves. No, I wasn't being aggressive, I was being assertive. Or, I'm plenty open-minded. No, really. That's the sucker in us, trying to guess the winning side of the moralizing coin they pretend to control. Or we might defend ourselves by accusing them of hypocrisy. Yeah, well, you just called me a name caller. Trump bots like that response. They can always toggle from prude to punk cynicism. So, you're just as bad as me. We're both in the sewer. I'm smart enough to know that reality doesn't mean anything. It's all just power grabs and I'll beat you. With obverse psychology, rather than getting defensive when a Trump bot accuses you of something, embrace it as one of the options in your fallibilist repertoire. For example, if a Trump bot charges you with being a name caller, don't deny it. You can say, of course I name call, like you, like everyone. You don't even notice that just now you called me a name caller. I don't want to just name call. I want to name call with surgical precision. For me, the question isn't whether to name call, but under what circumstances. You just name call all you want and pretend you never do by moralizing at people for name calling. If a Trump bot judges you for judging, don't deny it. Of course I judge. Like you, like everyone. You just judge me for judging you. I don't want to just judge. I want to judge right, which, blind to your own judging, is obviously not a question that interests you. You just call anyone who judges you immoral because you're too afraid to consider their opinion. I judge that as lame. You just hate what I stand for, they'll say, as if citing you for the worst possible offense, hating anything or anyone. They just hate. The typical civil response is to backtrack defensively. No, I don't hate anything or anyone. With obverse psychology, you don't deflect, you embrace wholeheartedly, hate being one side of the coin we carry. Damn straight I hate what you stand for. From what I can tell, you stand for nothing but your false claim of eternal heroism supplied by mindless moralizing. I hate, you hate, all humans hate. If you love something, you hate its opposite. I try to love and hate the right and not the wrong things. I'd like you just fine, buddy, if you just stop your mindless war on hate as though you would never stoop to hating anything. What do you think? You can just lobotomize a fundamental human emotion? You think you can shame me for hating? That's like trying to shame me for having a nose. You hate too. You just can't see it when you're busy playing Puritan. If a Trump bot says, you're insulting, you can use obverse psychology on that too. Don't deny it. Say something like, damn straight I'm sometimes insulting, like you, like everyone. But unlike you, I don't pretend I'm never insulting, and I don't define anything that disappoints me as insulting. That's toddler. If you want to talk about whether my insult fits how you're acting, I'm game. If you want to pretend you never insult or that insulting is always wrong, don't make me laugh, you turd blossom. You're being intolerant, they'll say. Don't take the bait. Denying your intolerance and defending your tolerance. Own your intolerance. Of course I'm intolerant. Like you, like everyone. Like you when you accuse me of being intolerant. The question for me isn't whether to be intolerant, but under what circumstances. I don't tolerate your fake absolute intolerance of intolerance. If you want to debate when to be intolerant, I'm up for that. If you want to pretend that one should never be intolerant, it only exposes how little you think about the morality you pretend to defend. You're arrogant, they'll say. More arrogant than claiming to be the authority on who's arrogant? Of course I'm arrogant sometimes. Like you, like anyone. I try to decide when to outrank, and here I'm pretty sure I outrank you in wondering about when to outrank. You just call arrogant anything that makes you feel inferior. If you want to posture as the supreme judge on who's arrogant, I'm not interested. With obverse psychology, the basic formula is this, and it's no magic bullet. Stand grounded in your two sides of the coin approach to life. Don't fall for their pretense that one side is always right and the other is always wrong. They don't mean it. They'll spin their moralizing the opposite way a moment later. That's fundamental to their mindless Trump-botting. Whatever they're doing is right and strong and best by some standard, whatever standard serves them in the moment. The problem with people like you is you don't listen, they'll say, posturing as though they always listen. Your defensive impulse might be to say that you listen and provide evidence. Do not take the bait. Use obverse psychology instead. Of course I don't listen to everything. Who does? Have you noticed how many people demand to be heard? Do you want to claim you listen to all of them? That would only prove you have no idea what you're talking about. I stopped listening to your words a while ago because all I heard from you is can't fail swagger, pulling out your ass whatever fake eternal principle serves you in the moment and ignoring it otherwise. For me, the question is when to listen, not whether. For you, I guess the question doesn't come up because you jerk off to the fantasy that you listen to everyone always. Trump bots will say the problem with people like you is that you generalize. Of course I generalize, like you just did about people like me. I don't want to just generalize. I want to generalize carefully. They'll say, you attacked my character, caught you. You use the ad hominem argument. Of course I attacked your character. I think you're acting like a total a-hole. You could get better, but at the moment you suck, playing God and blinding yourself to your own hypocrisy. You don't even notice that you're attacking my character for attacking your character. You have no idea how laughable your blindness looks. You blare your siren at anyone who disagrees with you and don't even notice that you're doing the same thing. I notice. That's why I think your character at present sucks. You may get shamed for savaging a Trump bot in public. Shame on you for shaming. You'll hear that from the Trump bot and from onlookers. Yes, I shame sometimes. Like you, like everyone. Like right now, you shaming me for shaming, though you don't seem to notice your hypocrisy. My approach is different. I admit that I shame. I don't take refuge as you do in pretending you don't do what you, in fact, do. My question, and it's life size and lifelong, is when to shame, not whether to shame. You seem to think you can blare your shaming moral police sirens so loud at others that you don't have to hear your own shaming. Never shame? Such nonsense. It stunts growth on what to me is the real question: when to shame. I get the wrong answer plenty. Sometimes I fail to shame when I should, and sometimes I shame when I shouldn't. So I adjust. I learn, whereas you seem to pretend that you've got nothing to learn because you know the absolute truth, though you don't live by it. Never, ever shame. Obverse psychology is different from saying, yeah, I name called, so what? Everybody does it. Everyone's an a-hole. The difference is subtle but important. With obverse psychology, you admit to the move they're accusing you of making. You own it, but you shift the debate away from the hypocritical to the critical, from the bogus claim to never use a move to the fallibilist lifelong dilemma facing reality about when to use it. You admit that you struggle with that question, and you shame the Trump bot for taking refuge in mindless lip service condemnation of the move. Absolute Trump bots toggle between black and white extremes so that when you do something, it's pure evil, but when they do it, it's pure virtue. They pay no attention to what their words mean, only to their connotations. If it's positive, it's about them. If it's negative, it's about you. What does a patriot mean? Whatever they're doing. What does tyranny mean? Whatever you're doing. What do faith and loyalty mean? Whatever they're doing. What do bias and prejudice mean? Whatever you're doing. When they win, might makes right. When they lose, might makes wrong. So flip it back on them. When they celebrate their victories, congratulate them for being among the ranks of Hitler and Stalin, who were also victorious for a time. When they insist that they are winners and you're a loser, thank them. You are like Jesus, their hero who lost yet was virtuous. When they say that they're like Jesus, oppressed but destined to prevail and reign eternal, remind them that that's what Stalin said too. When they boast of having absolute faith in themselves, congratulate them for following in the footsteps of mental patients who have complete confidence in themselves. When they preen about their honesty, applaud them for being just like their worst enemies, the fools who honestly believe what the Trump bot absolutely abhors. When they say that they're members of the woke, all-inclusive group where love reigns, commend them for joining the ranks of the fundamentalists they despise. When they declare with New Age hippie pride that they've transcended intellectualism, celebrate their solidarity with Sarah Palin. When they tout their commitment to be here now mindfulness, likewise bless their devotion to the same attitude as Trump. I'll call this variation on obverse psychology strained bedfellows. It exposes the way that their momentary formula for claiming heroism puts them uncomfortably in bed with their foes. When they condemn you for having negative traits, flip it. Fallibilists know those negative traits are positive in some contexts. When they condemn people for lying, congratulate them for being the kind of people who would tell the masters where the runaway slaves are hidden. When they condemn disloyal quitters, commend them for being the kind who would have stayed with Hitler's goon squads no matter what. Find the most familiar and dissonance-generating strained bedfellow examples you can. I illustrate with Hitler and Stalin a lot here, but just as examples. Stalin is useful with right-wing Trump bots because they hate communism, not that Stalin was a communist or that the Trump bot could define it. Stalin was a Trump bot. Communism was just a bullshit-dozing jersey he wore. The point is to show them how their supposed principles land them in bed with their enemies. Know their enemies so you can confuse them with parallels. Expose that their supposed principles don't stand up to scrutiny. Here's another fallibilism flaunting strategy I'll call feet to the fire. When they extol their virtue for standing up for any last word principle, expose their hypocrisy by humoring them. The generic form is, good, I'll count you as absolutely committed to that principle. You must be troubled by the way you and your kind violate that principle. So, for example, good, I've got you down as absolutely committed to civility. Your brain must be deep fried by Trump's endless put-downs of his opponents. Feet to the fire is deflating in two ways. It exposes that they're in bad company and that they have company. Trump bots think they're exceptional. They're not. They're just humans who have detoured to Aholia, a brain-melting, melting pot metropolis. Aholia welcomes all kinds. People who have had a-hole revelations don't like to discover that others have had a-hole revelations so radically different from their own. If you've seen the light, you don't want to hear about others who have seen it too and come to very different conclusions about what it means. Trump bots are convinced that what makes them exceptional is their last word brilliance, not their generic exploitation of the Trump bot formula. Finding out you have company on your high horse that you consider low-lifers is like meeting your ex's doltish next partner. If your muse can fall for a person like that, what does it say about them having fallen for you? When you point out that a Trump bot is in bed with the people they hate, and the people they hate are in bed with the people they like, they'll say, no, that's different. Don't compare apples and oranges. Invite them to tutor you on how to distinguish the apples from the oranges. For example, press them for an objective way to distinguish between a counterspun pair of terms like steadfast and pig-headed. Be relentless. Once you've taken some bait, don't let them lead you by the nose to some other debate. When they fail to give you a straight answer, mark their failure. All right, I've asked you 3 times to explain the distinction, and each time you change the subject, I'll count that as you not having an answer. They'll insist they did answer. Ask them to remind you what their answer was. If they change the subject again, calmly register that. Bring the audience in on it, or at least imagine an audience. If someone was watching us, I bet they wouldn't have heard your answer either. The Trump cult was allowed to wield weaponized words for far too long without being cornered with defining them. They won elections by spouting about how their opponents were all socialists or communists. It's a tragic marvel how long their opponents and interviewers allowed them to get away with it, never bothering to demand a definition for their weaponized terms. The Trump cultists couldn't have defined the terms. They could give boogeyman examples, but examples are not definitions. You can't just say communists are like Stalin. That's an example, not what scientists call an operational definition. And it's an extreme example too, useless in the gray areas. Demand operational definitions, not necessarily accurate, but at least employable or operatable by anyone. For example, imagine hiring someone to distinguish a-holes from non-a-holes. What would you give them as a standard to apply? You can't just say, like Hitler. Demanding operational definitions is a good way to corner Trump bots with the questions they're avoiding by paying attention only to connotations. Demand real denotations. How to distinguish between communists and non-communists, between steadfast and pig-headed. I want to come back to this question because it's important. Fallibilists have alternating standards depending on the situation, and so do Trump bots. What then is the difference between a fallibilist pursuit of the wisdom to know when to do what and the Trump bot's alternation between, for example, on the one hand, whining about how insulting you are, and the next moment proclaiming themselves anti-PC, unlike the snowflakes who whine? After all, you're both alternating between options. I suggest that one key difference is between awareness and non-awareness of alternating. A fallibilist knows they're alternating and is trying to fit their response to their real-world circumstances. In contrast, Trump bots deny alternating. They claim and defend their absolute consistency, but the only thing consistent about them is their claim that they are consistent. They insist that they never ever violate their moral absolutes while, in fact, they do. In other words, Trump bots lack the wisdom to keep noticing the differences that make a difference. Maybe you've sat listening to a friend as they weigh options, trying to decide something difficult, feeling of two minds and admitting it. They contradict themselves on the one hand, on the other hand, and they know it. They don't deny their ambivalence. And maybe you've sat listening to a friend who expresses similar ambivalence but denies it. If you point out that they're contradicting themselves, they'll bite your head off for misunderstanding. They insist they're being consistent when they aren't. I've always found it far easier to listen to someone who admits to their ambivalence than someone who denies it. The denier is like someone who needs to feel like they're upright even while they're flip-flopping. To maintain their sense that they've got their head upright, they'll flip the whole world upside down, including you. They project their ambivalence on you. Why do you keep misunderstanding me? I'm being consistent. When they're in a hole, these are people who don't stop digging. They simply declare that down is up and that by digging deeper, they're climbing higher. We're often told that Trump bots have a chip on their shoulder, that their bravado compensates for their lack of confidence. It's not always the case. There are many detours to aholia. Still, if Trump bots weren't so threatening, we'd notice that many are nervous Nellies, driven by high levels of that unconscious anxiety universal to all humans, as we explored in Class 5. Usually the best strategy is to gently coax people down out their trees, and that's what most researchers recommend. Be nice to them, and they'll calm down, regaining a receptivity and appreciation for give and take. But I'm arguing here that that's not a one-size-fits-all solution. It might work with budding Trump bots, but not with anyone who has taken up permanent residence in Aholia. Can you imagine it working with Trump? Have you ever tried it with a true Trump bot? Instead, I'm suggesting that you ignore their ideas. They mean nothing more to the Trump bot than weaponized smokescreens. Respect the person hiding under that smokescreen and draw a sharp contrast between their costly, rigid fragility, call it frigidity, and the easy, humble, grounded confidence of fallibilism. Fallibilism is actually the more confident attitude. Not confidence that one is always right, not confidence that one is officially and absolutely learned, but confidence in oneself as an ever-bettering better among betters. And if you are a fallibilist, you have an obligation, a civic duty, to flaunt your fallibilism tauntingly at these fake infallibilist Trump bots. Obverse psychology and its variations described here are how you corner Trump bots with word meanings. If they want to call you a name caller, that's fine. You're not insulted. You're not going to let them get away with pretending to police the world with words they know only by their connotations. Every time we indulge a Trump bot's spin and frame dominance, we enable them. Every time we allow them to pretend that they mean their words as anything more than weaponized bullshit dosing, we encourage them to engage in still more bullshit dosing. Do not be a sucker trying to win against their loaded coin flips. Do not humor their word weaponizing by feeling guilty when they police you. If they accuse you of name calling, don't give in to some automatic knee-jerk guilt and self-defense. You may think that's the conscientious thing to do, but it's the reverse, the unconscionable indulgence of a moralizing Trump bot. We must corner them with the meaning of the words they spew, or we're letting Trump bots loose on the world in violation of our civic duty. The next class is our second to last. We'll be talking about offensive strategies, how to grab and rattle their sword hilt, how to stick their nose in the stench of their Trump-botting lifestyle. Our final class will focus on how any of us can safely indulge our appetite for playing God to deal with human life's anxieties. Hey, and thanks for sticking with this. Glad you're here.